Kia ora. E na rau rangatira mā, nau mai haere mai, whakato mai ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Kotaho ko te kairahi o te putea whai whakaro. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm Barry Coates. I'm founder and CEO of Mindful Money. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. Tonight, I'm thrilled that we are in conversation with Rod Oram. As most of you know, Rod is not only a business journalist and broadcaster, but he's also a highly respected researcher and an advocate for sustainability and action on climate change. As I'm sure most of you know by now, Rod's been in Glasgow reporting on Climate Summit COP26, and we are so grateful to Rod for fitting us into his incredibly busy schedule. I don't know how you get the time, Rod, to do all the writing and reporting that you do. But typical of Rod's generosity, he's agreed to donate his time to Mindful Money for this seminar. So I hope all of you in the audience will join with us to make a contribution to Rod's travel costs for travel to Glasgow. The link is in the chat function. So we'd be very grateful if you do that. Rod, with only a few days of the summit left, I hope we're going to traverse the highlights, the promises, what it's all going to mean in the cold light of day when we finally get clear of MIQ and get back to New Zealand. We're going to sort of talk across a lot of different issues. So for the audience, please don't necessarily wait to the end for your questions. As you think of them, put them in the Q&A, and we'll have a nice list of questions to discuss as we go along and later on in the seminar. So, Rod, a very warm welcome to you.
Well, kia ora tātou, Barry. It's a great pleasure to be online with you and with everybody else who's joined today. So thank you. And thank you for having a slightly later time for this at your end. It's pretty early my time. It's 7 o'clock in the morning and it's still very dark here in Glasgow and 5 degrees centigrade, a very Scottish winter's morning. And so it's a great pleasure to be online with you. And
we've interrupted your porridge breakfast, I gather.
Yeah, I will resist having the last few spoonfuls while we're online.
be our guest. So, Rod, I'm going to kick off with the good news. So what's happened at COP26 that has given you particular optimism about a climate future? I mean, do we have one?
We do. It's just a question of how acceptable that future is going to be. No, I am very significantly encouraged and buoyed up by what I'm finding here. And that's because there is amongst the people here a real sense of urgency. And if I can sort of summarize what I think is a sort of a core frame of mind and sort of state of heart of many of the delegates I've talked to, is they combine three wonderful qualities. On one hand, they have this steely-eyed view, an understanding of how critical this all is and how short the time is. They have huge creativity and optimism about what can be done. And then the third thing is they are so eager to be there seeking alliances and people that they can work with and, of course, fight back against all the stuff they don't want. So many of the people I talk to have that wonderful combination. And so it's extremely energizing, I have to say. The next thing is that I have no idea what the median age is. That's a bit of demographic data the UN doesn't tell us. They tell us how many men versus women, etc. But my hunch is that the median age is probably only say high 30s. Now you'll have older people at more senior levels in political delegations, and unfortunately they're the people making a lot of the decisions. But I've been hearing wonderful stories from people who are in negotiating rooms about how on quite a few country delegations there's actually officials who are younger who are demonstrating those qualities that I discussed. And so whilst the agenda and final decision will be set by their older, more senior colleagues, they're still in the negotiations trying to find, saying, well, what about this? What about that? Could we do this? And I think that's completely wonderful. And of course, has reinforced my feeling I've had for a long time that with all due respects to you and me, Barry, our role in life is to support people like that, because they're the ones who it's their future, not ours.
I couldn't agree more, Rod. And sort of recalling, I've been to a few of these COPs myself over the years, and it's almost 30 years since the Framework Convention was signed. And as you say, a lot of the people at COP26 were not born around the time that the convention was first signed. And the fact that we're in this situation now where we've left it to the 59th minute of the 11th hour is pretty tragic. But it's great to hear your optimism. So let's kind of go into one or two of the issues that particularly from week one, where there are a lot of promises, a lot of pledges, some of what sounded like really good declarations. So let's start with coal, as one should in talking about climate change. Alok Sharma declared, as you well know, the end of coal is in sight. But I think that perhaps that was slightly overstating the situation. How is that looking now, a week after the announcements?
I'll start with an overarching dynamic in all of these announcements, that they are aspirational, and many of them don't have particular deadlines or hard targets. And indeed, on some of them, and I'll come back to this particularly on the Global Methane Pledge, countries don't have to sign up to any kind of target at all. However, I think it's really important to acknowledge and be happy about the agreements and the alliances, because that is people coming together to try to deliver some action. But of course, then one has to be very realistic and know there's a lot of work to to push people along to live up to those. And that is exactly what happened on coal. So there was sort of signer's remorse very quickly after the coal one, with Poland going, we're actually a very small country, we can't do this. Actually, they're the 23rd largest economy in the world, and their cities are very smoggy. And similarly, South Korea backed off. And it was left to Indonesia and Vietnam, who are two serious coal-fired burners, to be the biggest breakthrough countries in that group. And so that's a very common dynamic. Having said that, on coal, there is clearly this ramping up pressure. But of course, the biggest thing is the economics of this, and the economics of coal, even before you put a price on the emissions, are already out of viability compared with renewables. So on one hand, the task is to ramp up the renewables as fast as possible. And the second thing is to bring every dynamic, every play possible to shut down coal in the same way that oil and gas has been gradually shut down. That's the objective. And so that becomes a very big civil society issue globally and within countries to fight that. And that puts Australia, for example, seriously out on a limb. They really are the outliers here amongst developed countries, and they're catching a great deal of flack for that. I think they must feel themselves fairly bulletproof at this point, and are not necessarily swayed by that. But that pressure is mounting on Australia, and that's what has to happen. That's where the real action is.
And certainly for New Zealand, we're by no means completely out of coal by any means, and even there's proposals for new coal mines, and so I guess we've got some distance to go ourselves to give reality to this. And I like the your interview with Kingsmill Bond from Climate Action Tracker, who said why would anyone develop a new coal-fired facility at the moment, knowing what a short time horizon there is before coal is inevitably going to be finished? What do you think of? So, is New Zealand kind of mentioned in the coal discussions at all, or are we just too small to really rate a other than a passing comment?
I've heard no comment at all, but of course there's this vast conversation going on here, and I'm literally only hearing snippets. I'm trying to follow particular themes. I haven't heard New Zealand mentioned in the coal context. I'd be very surprised if we did. We are a large, by our standards, buyer of Indonesian coal, but we are an irrelevant customer to Indonesia in that sense.
Yeah.
But do note, though, that Indonesia signing up to that coal alliance was considered a win.
Yeah. Rod, can we also have a quick reaction on methane? Sometime after the methane announcement, so 30% reduction by 2030, but the focus mainly on methane emissions by the fossil fuel industry. Is that correct? And not so much on agriculture, which is obviously the biggest issue for New Zealand.
It's broadly that, but there's an interesting extra dynamic in there, which I'll come to in a moment. But in many ways, the Global Methane Pledge is by far the most significant thing about COP, because it shows how rapidly methane has absolutely shot to the top of the greenhouse gas agenda this year. That's partly because of very big reports that have really brought to the forefront that methane, which is responsible for about 40% of warming over recent decades, and methane's growing faster than carbon dioxide, methane levels in absolute terms have got to come down very fast. So this old argument, and it's the one used by our farmers in particular, but it's a short-lived gas, it'll go away. The point is that it's going to be doing enormous damage while it's there, so that's why we've got to pull it back and forget the argument that it's going to go away in due course. And so the US and the EU put together the Global Methane Pledge only 6 weeks before COP started. They had 20 countries signed up at the beginning of COP, and now it's well over 100. So that is important. And yes, the focus is on the, I always hate the phrase, but the low-hanging fruit, because there are a lot of very leaky oil and gas pipelines, particularly gas, and that's the biggest source of methane from that sector. But there's now a significant number of satellites up in the air tracking that, which are pinpointing leaks incredibly rapidly and making sure they're fixed. So there's actually a geopolitical development in this too, or an angle to this, because it's a way for the European Union, which is of course a big user of gas from Russia, and the US, to put a lot of political pressure on Russia and China, who have famously very leaky pipelines. So on one hand, it's an important climate thing to do, but it's also a very useful stick for the US and the EU to wave or otherwise threaten. I don't know how they threaten it, but with Russia and China. But so that's the low-hanging fruit. But agriculture is actually the largest source of human-induced methane. It's bigger than oil and gas sector, and that's not going away. There's a big focus on that. And once there is progress on the oil and gas side, you're going to see more progress on agriculture. But that fits very well with a big theme here at COP about sustainable agriculture, where reducing methane is very much in the center of that. And that's why it's absolutely unconscionable for any farming entity or country that depends a lot on farming, particularly a developed country, not to set serious methane reduction targets. Or, in the case of New Zealand, Fonterra, which is responsible for about something slightly over 20% of New Zealand's entire emissions, it and its farmers, says, oh, we're going to be net zero by 2050, but it tells us, it doesn't give us any idea of how it's going to get there, and it set itself no goals on methane reduction. And Fonterra is the largest dairy exporter in the world, and my hunch is they won't be able to stick with that non-commitment very much longer. So I think that the methane pledge will help put pressure on the main agricultural entities in developed countries, and fast forward all the science that is needed to help small subsistence farmers and others in developing countries. But I think from an agricultural point of view, you have to see that methane issue as two completely separate things. If you're an agro-industrial dairy producer, the heat is on you to reduce methane emissions. If you're a smallholder farmer with one cow in a developing country, the FAO and every agricultural NGO in the world will be coming around you and your millions of others around the world to get you onto a low methane trajectory. But those are two completely separate pictures, and so we mustn't take our focus off the agro-industrial complex.
Yes, and in all of this, how is New Zealand's reputation on sustainable agriculture given the discussions, the commitments, the leadership being shown? Are we being seen to be one of the leaders internationally, as some of us would like us to be seen?
Oh, yes. So many people say, oh, you're from New Zealand, you're leading wonderfully on agriculture. So all our false promises are still sitting out there. I don't launch into a long explanation of what's really going on in New Zealand, but I say, well, actually, that's not the case. And I mention our targets and the rest. So yes, we still have that reputation out there. But it's not an earned reputation, and it's a false reputation. And at some point, that's going to catch up with us.
Yeah. Good. Rod, can we move to the other side of the equation? Because so often climate change action is seen as a cost to be borne. Elements of the breakthrough agenda have been very much around the fact that there are now amazing new opportunities that are perhaps not being taken up at the scale and the speed that they should be. Are you encouraged by what's been happening around renewable energy and the other breakthrough sectors?
Yes, but always there's this caveat to cheer, but immediately say yes, but not big enough, fast enough. However, there are very interesting feedback loops going on here, mutually reinforcing dynamics. So overall, civil society is moving far faster than governments on most issues, but that then is pushing governments to make bigger pledges and come up with policies. So, for example, the UK government, for all its promises about a net zero by 2050, had really struggled to produce a plausible roadmap of how the UK economy was going to get there. And this was horribly stuck and caught in interdepartmental warfare in Whitehall before that was finally announced just before COP. And the verdict was from the UK Climate Change Committee, the equivalent of our Climate Change Commission, that this was good. There's still lots of gaps, but a big improvement. So that's a good reinforcing dynamic. But by many measures, the other really big thing that's happened here is how much money is lining up behind very loosely determined sustainability investment. And I stress the loosely. As you were, of course, incredibly familiar with mindful money, that flow of money has become kind of a tsunami of money into this very broad camp that calls itself sustainable investing. And of course, you get rigorous through to not in that. And Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who is now co-lead with Michael Bloomberg as a UN special envoy on climate finance, has put together I promise is the only acronym of this, GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And the astonishing number is Carney's claiming US $130 trillion of private sector capital has declared that it wants to be a member. But again, here comes the if, buts, and ands. GFANZ puts essentially no requirements on that money. So a really good requirement have been, you can only join if you promise not to invest any more money in fossil fuels. That's not there. It's a big honeypot, but no, I'm mixing my metaphors, but there's no stick in it. And so that's why sustainability metrics that seriously measure an investor and an investee's sustainability performance is so fundamentally important. And one last point on that is that I think another very significant thing here, as the United Nations has announced, it's going to start work on a framework to take all non-government net zero pledges and find ways to analyze them and hold people accountable to them, whether you be a city or a region or a company. That's a huge task. I don't know how fast they will get to a framework, let alone make it active. But I think that's a good sign that rigor is coming into this. Sorry, I'm going to add one more thought. The Science Based Targets Initiative is fundamentally important to this, because this is the best way for, say, a company to make a net zero commitment and all its reductions be based on the climate science and get that seal of approval from SBTi. Their big announcement here was they're extending that methodology to cities and regions. And so again, that's another example of that rigor that's coming into the process. And it's only a start. We need far more rigor. But I take these sorts of trends as positive.
Yes, indeed. That is. Thank you, Rod. That's a kind of covering a lot of territory in that the net zero commitments in New Zealand we obviously covered in our last seminar. So for those who missed it, this is a really great seminar on the Mindful Money website from last Thursday, where a number of New Zealand fund managers and Crown financial institutions announced commitments to net zero. As you say, Rod, they aren't necessarily watertight, but what it does do is it moves funds often from no real action on reducing their emissions, at least to making that commitment, and then sets up an accountability framework where they can be held to their pledge. And they are one of the really important things is that they have to disclose. They have to disclose their progress against their targets. They have to update their targets. They have to show how they're going to achieve the net zero over a period of time, according to short-term targets as well as medium-term targets. So I think there are great ways for civil society and members of the public and other fund managers to hold the pledges to account. And so we've been given this great opportunity by these commitments. I think it's up to us to make sure that they're used in the right way. Rod, I wanted to sort of come on to the issue about what all this adds up to. So I've noted the International Energy Agency, in a burst of enthusiasm, said we're closing in on 1.5 degree pathway. I think they said 1.8 degrees. And now Carbon Action Tracker and other very reputable analysts have come back and said, well, actually, we haven't made that much progress at all. It's more like 2.4 degree pathway. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
There's a very simple dynamic there. The IEA was only measuring the commitments and taking them at face value as if they were all going to be delivered. That's an uncharacteristically superficial piece of analysis by IEA, I'd have to say, which they may now regret. And so what Carbon Action Tracker came out with yesterday was that deeply knowledgeable research view as first of all, what are the pledges? What would current policies actually deliver, but what would promised policies actually deliver? And then what policies do you need to actually deliver fully on those pledges, or even better, get to 1.5. So that was the difference between the two. So in one sense, they're not contradictory. It's just that Carbon Action Tracker has carried on from where the IEA left off. And I must admit, I was one of many who went, whoa, gosh, IEA, they're credible, that's good. And I and many others didn't stop to think about that analysis, and that's what we now have. But that's perfectly timed, because there is still a big push here to keep ramping up countries' commitments, and I hope that words kind of fail me. I was going to say bucket of cold water. I mean, it's bigger than that. Will put some extra energy and imperative into these last couple of days of negotiation to try to ramp up those commitments some more. There's actually one interesting dynamic here where we don't know how it will play out. In all the past COPs, the world leaders would come in at the end to be the magnificent problem solvers, the guarantees of the guarantors of the big breakthrough, which is exactly what happened at Paris. Yes. But here, for reasons, well, I've heard one explanation which might be plausible. The UK decided to have the World Leaders Summit at the beginning as sort of setting the scene, and they hoped that big impetus from the world leaders at the beginning would create that momentum all the way through. I think that's wishful thinking, because people get tireder as the 2 weeks go on. And so if I had to choose, I think I'd prefer to have the world leaders here at the end, not the beginning.
How interesting. I'm sure the next few days are going to be difficult as the officials get mired in the usual arguments over the placement of commas and such like. Yeah. Rod, we've got a question in from Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow as well. Rachel's asking about the financing of nature, and perhaps whether there has been any interesting discussions with regard to either climate offsetting arrangements or in fact other aspects of financing nature.
Well, kia ora, Rachel, and I'm going to be very careful to come up with a whole bunch of new things to say tomorrow on the SBN's.
This is a plug for Sustainable Business Network's seminar right. Tomorrow.
And it's a really good question. I need to offer a very big disclaimer at the beginning. I am, first of all, not following the negotiations sort of like a 20-over cricket game, ball by ball, because that's too arcane. I'm just interested in the outcome. I'm interested in the dynamics. But similarly, on any given topic, I am not I have scant knowledge. I have I'm as profound as an oil slick across all of these subjects, because I'm trying to make sense of a whole bunch of stuff. So I don't know the detail. My strong sense, though, on biodiversity is that the great goal that the UN had for these negotiations, which was to make the world realize we have co-crises of climate breakdown and ecosystem collapse, and the causes of the two are the same, and therefore a solution to one can often help the other. And so the UN was trying to bring its two streams under the COP biodiversity and the COP for climate change together. That hasn't been very successful here. And so a lot of the progress on nature has still been targeted random things. We're still a long way from seeing any kind of integrated picture here. And similarly, the emphasis, this is a sweeping statement, but I think it's very broadly true. The emphasis is on saving nature rather than restoring nature. And I think that's a really important balance that's still wrong. Of course, we've got to stop degrading nature, but we obviously need a far bigger emphasis on helping nature restore and regenerate itself. And my sense is we're not seeing anywhere near enough on the latter. And to me, New Zealand is missing this extraordinary opportunity here. We should be fierce. We should be at the forefront of that. That's kind of who we are as a people. It is what we are as a country. And we would get a lot of buy-in. I mean, yes, we're not a developing country that has an horribly degraded environment. But I still think we have a very good story to tell to the world. And as these views of biodiversity restoration as a climate solution, but also the benefit of rebuilding nature start to really take off, New Zealand needs to be in the absolute forefront of that, and we're not. I actually have to say that New Zealand is essentially invisible here at COP.
Yes, including the blue economy, which a number of the Pacific Island countries have repeatedly raised. And for New Zealand, we are one of the largest ocean territories in the world.
We've got the fourth largest exclusive economic zone in the world, and it's an amazing area because it's the South Pacific and it's the Southern Ocean, and both of which have the highest level of endemic species. They're the less damaged of the oceans. It's the North Pacific that is suffering terribly. And so we have this huge taonga there, and we don't even have an oceans policy in New Zealand. We have a dysfunctional mess of coastal and other marine legislation. That the government's planning to work on that should it have another term, but still we don't have it.
Rod, while we're on nature and natural systems, Simon Miller from Pure Advantage is asking about the deforestation commitments. I noticed that Indonesia had got home after COP and immediately rolled back on their deforestation commitments. Is there anything there that you'd have to, you gives you optimism and some cause for thinking it may be different this time?
Yes, but by nature I'm a reasonably optimistic person. Yes, for two reasons. There was lots of guffaws around the place, well, darker than guffaws, about Brazil signing up for this. But it's really important to understand there's more to Brazil than the current president, as powerful as he is. And so there are a lot of people in Brazil who are desperately fighting to stop deforestation in the Amazon. So this is just one more international measure to try and make that happen. So it reinforces the people who are working hard on this in Brazil. But very interestingly, Brazil has suddenly joined the 1.5 degree club. Again, no plans, but it's clear that they are trying desperately to enhance their climate credibility. That's a very easy way to do it. Stop deforesting the Amazon would be a much better way of doing it. But I think so I think the alliance is important for that. But the other reason it's important was there was something like $283 billion, as memory serves, of money attached to that, a drop in the bucket of what's needed, and we need to see that money spent well. But again, money does speak of some kind of commitment. So as I understand it, it's the first of those kind of deforestation pledges. It always takes a lot of time to put real discipline in them and real commitment into them. But at least it's a start.
Very good. Rod, we're going to have to wrap up in 5 or 10 minutes, but can I just ask you a question about the dynamics of what's been happening? Because typically, as you've alluded to, you've got governments who are announcing things and the officials are hunkered down in negotiations. You've got civil society who are pressing for action and raising public awareness. You've got industry who are pushing for particular proposals and often promoting their own solutions. What struck you about the partnerships, about the dynamics between the different sectors?
The location explains an awful lot of things. I'll try and keep this as simple as possible. The Scottish Events Campus is huge, and there's a number of major permanent buildings here, which are all very different. So at the west end of this long campus, it's about a 15-minute brisk walk from the security fence on the east end to the security fence on the west end. That's where government delegation offices are, and back from that are meeting rooms. And those are largely temporary buildings, 2 stories high, which are very gloomy. I'm hearing very uncomfortable things from people spending long time in windowless negotiating rooms. And then in the middle, there's an exhibition hall where there's lots of country pavilions, and it's like, it's like a world trades fair of every conceivable thing you can think of on this journey. And then you move further on and you come to this huge circular auditorium called the OVO Hydro, and that's called the Action Hub. And there's this huge globe hanging in the middle, and it slowly rotates. And people are sitting around on bean bags at tables, and the whole it's not a word I normally use, vibe in there is completely different. And then lastly, off to one side, there's a whole bunch of, again, temporary meeting rooms for sort of some more side events. So just the accommodation tells you a lot about the mindset. And I just think it would be completely wonderful if the government negotiators could stop sitting around tables and perhaps sit on a few beanbags to nut out some of this stuff. Because, but that to me is the glory of this. This really is a hui of humanity. And those are the very, very different dynamics. And it's just a complete microcosm of society. And then, of course, outside, you have the demonstrators. Not much close into COP because the police have been pretty fierce about that. And interestingly, each day there is a token demonstration allowed very decorously and only for a short time in the meeting, the cloakroom area. Once you finally got through security, there was a no carbon markets one there yesterday, and I think they have to be largely silent. And I might put this picture up today, a picture of them. They'd obviously had their allotted time where they were folding up their banners and then going off. So the serious protests, of course, was on the Global Day of Climate Justice on Sunday here and around the world. And so this absolutely is, humanity, warts and all, in all its glory and all its desperately depressing. I'm going for alliteration here. This is terrible. Depravity. No, it's not that bad. But, well, no, it is. It is that bad. I mean, we're talking about, we all know that. Right.
And sorry, Rod, just one last thing. I mean, you mentioned carbon markets protesters, and obviously one of the key things for the New Zealand delegation, which has been the case for the past 20 years, is carbon markets. And how are you assessing the possibility of progress here? Because obviously New Zealand's commitments and its whole approach to domestic emissions reductions is very dependent on having unlimited access to carbon markets.
As I understand it, we already have Plan B. And of course, Plan A is the Article 6 rulebook on carbon markets gets passed. But at the beginning of the week, there were still 300 square brackets in the negotiating text. So, sorry, for those who are not into all this, that's the text that people can't agree on. So that's an awful lot to work through. There is, I think, a real determination to get that through. And we'll see what happens by midnight or shortly after on Friday. But as I understand it, the New Zealand's position on that is, it doesn't. It's a shame if that doesn't go through, but we can still find plenty of credible credits in places that we have confidence through a bilateral arrangement or some other multilateral arrangement about the quality of those credits. And at face value, that's semi-plausible. But of course, it does avoid the really important issue that what they're trying to get to with Article 6 is a framework by which all emissions are properly accounted for. Yeah. And if you're off somewhere else doing something with somebody else in the absence of an international framework, then we're not sure that's going to be properly counted. And of course, it then comes back to the issue we're so familiar with in New Zealand. The first priority has to be actual reductions of your own emissions. And that's where New Zealand is a serious outlier in planning to use so much international offsets.
Yes, which is a rather sobering way to end the discussion with the amount of work that we've got to do in order to make those domestic emissions reductions. It's I guess it's the work on that our climate minister is going to come back to New Zealand and have to redouble our efforts through the emissions reduction plan. We all must. This is a civil society thing because politicians will only move. I mean, we are a democracy. We should salute this. Will only move as fast as the majority or the critical mass. So it's entirely up to so we shouldn't be blaming politicians. We should be accepting some responsibility of ourselves that as members of civil society, apparently we're not being effective enough in convincing enough people because that's something we have to take very seriously. All of us engaged in this. Thank you. Nice call to action to end. Thanks, Rod. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you've got a busy day ahead and a busy 4 days in front of you. So thank you so much for fitting in the time to do this and for your incredibly insightful analysis of what's happening at COP26.
Oh, thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be with you. And thanks, everyone, for joining online.
Cheers. So for everyone still here, a special thank you for you, our audience. Next week, we're going to take a well-earned break. And then on Wednesday, the 24th of November, please join us for a fascinating panel discussion about the role that investment funds and KiwiSaver funds can play in gearing up social housing. This is an area where increasingly long-term finance, such as KiwiSaver funds, is starting to go into the development of social housing projects with community housing organisations involved. We've got a great seminar talking about that in 2 weeks' time, so I hope you join us. In the meantime, thanks to our sponsors for the event, so AMP, Booster, Generate KiwiSaver and Harbour Asset Management, and others alongside them. So thank you. Hope to see you next week, or the week after next rather. Ka kite anō.